The entire town of Blackstone Ridge feared him, and no one dared admit why. Not because he had killed anyone, not because he had done anything cruel, but because he was so different, so quiet, so big, so lonely, that people needed him to be a monster so they could feel better about themselves. But that night, as snow buried the mountains and the screams of trapped children echoed down the cliffs, only one person emerged. Not the sheriff, not the men who had called him a monster for years. It was him. Which city are you watching from? Please like and comment your city name below so I know how far this story has come. Don't leave. This is just the beginning. The day Alara Quinn rode into Blackstone Ridge, the temperature had already dropped far enough that her breath came out in short, ragged clouds that disappeared before they reached her horse's ears. She'd been riding since before dawn, crossing the lower switchbacks from Denison Pass with nothing but a wool coat that hadn't been thick enough when she bought it, and certainly wasn't thick enough now. Her saddlebags were packed light. A change of clothes, a folded map she no longer trusted, 3 days of dried provisions, and a letter she'd read so many times the creases had gone soft. The letter was from her brother. It was 6 weeks old. Blackstone Ridge wasn't much to look at coming in from the south. A main street of maybe 10 buildings, half of them doubled as something else. The feed store also sold rope and lamp oil and occasionally functioned as an informal post station when the actual mail carrier was drunk, which was often. There was a saloon, naturally, a dry goods operation run out of what had once been a private home, a livery stable at the far end of the street that smelled strongly enough to be identifiable from 50 yards out, and a hotel, the word hotel being used generously, that occupied the second floor of a building whose ground floor sold hardware and bootlegging supplies with roughly equal enthusiasm. Alara pulled up outside the livery and climbed down from her horse with the particular stiffness of someone who'd been riding too long without a proper break. Her right knee complained loudly. She ignored it. She'd been ignoring it for the better part of 2 years, ever since a bad fall down a hillside outside of Cheyenne had left the joint with a tendency to stiffen in cold weather and a complete unwillingness to be ignored when it was doing so. She was 28 years old, broad-shouldered for a woman, with a face that people tended to describe as striking rather than pretty, which she'd long since understood was a polite way of saying her features were too strong and her expression too direct for most people's comfort. She carried weight on her frame that some women in the town she'd passed through had looked at with something between pity and disapproval, the kind of look that suggested she should be apologizing for the space she occupied. Alara had never once apologized for the space she occupied. She handed her horse off to the liveryman, a wiry teenager who took the reins without comment and led the animal inside, and stood for a moment in the street, getting her bearings. A woman sweeping the boardwalk outside the dry goods store had stopped sweeping. She was staring. Alara stared back. The woman went back to sweeping. The inside of the saloon was warmer than the street, which wasn't saying much. A pot-bellied stove in the corner was doing its best against a draft that came in around the doorframe every time someone opened it, which was frequently. 4 men sat at a table near the window playing cards with the focused silence of people who'd been playing the same game long enough that conversation had become unnecessary. The barkeep, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a mustache that had probably been impressive decades ago and was now merely large, looked up when Alara came in and gave her the kind of look that managed to be both assessing and dismissive simultaneously. "What can I get you?" he said. It wasn't really a question. Information, mostly. Alara settled onto a stool at the bar. Her knee was grateful for the rest. "And something hot if you've got it." "Got coffee. It's been on since this morning." "I'll take it." He poured. The coffee was thick and dark and tasted like it had been made in a different decade, but it was hot, and Alara wrapped both hands around the mug and felt some of the cold start to loosen its grip on her fingers. "I'm looking for someone," she said. "Thomas Quinn. He was working a claim up near the North Ridge. Came through here maybe 8 weeks back, possibly more recently. Medium height, dark hair, tends to talk too much when he's nervous." The barkeep's expression didn't change in any way that gave her information. "Lot of men come through." This one would have been asking questions about the syndicate survey activity up near the Caldwell Pass area. He mentioned this town specifically in a letter. That got a reaction. Small, just a slight tightening around the eyes. but she caught it. "Can't say I remember him," the barkeep said. The card players had gone quiet. Not the kind of quiet that meant they'd stopped paying attention. The opposite kind. Alara drank her coffee and didn't push it. She'd been doing this long enough to know when pushing would get her less than nothing. She paid for the coffee more than it was worth, and left the saloon with the particular sensation of eyes on her back that she'd learned to take as useful data rather than a reason for anxiety. Outside, the sky had shifted. The gray that had been sitting low over the mountain peaks since morning had deepened into something more purposeful. A man who'd lived in high country long enough would have looked at that sky and started making immediate decisions about shelter. Alara had lived in high country long enough. She looked at it and felt the familiar tightening in her chest that meant she had less time than she'd wanted. The storm hadn't been forecast this early, but weather in this part of the territory had its own opinions about forecasts. She was standing in the street considering her options when she saw the man for the first time. He came around the corner of the hardware store from the direction of the freight yard, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had never once in his life needed to hurry because the world tended to get out of his way on its own. He was enormous, not merely tall, but built in a way that made tall seem like an insufficient word. Well over 6 feet, with shoulders that filled the doorway of the general store as he passed it, even though he wasn't within 3 feet of the doorway. He wore a canvas coat that had been repaired in at least 4 places with different materials, and carried a pack that would have staggered most men as though it weren't there. His face was half hidden beneath a beard that had grown past the point of being intentional, and was now simply a fact of his face, the same way the scars were facts, one running jaw to cheekbone on the left side, another crossing his left eyebrow and disappearing into his hairline. He was looking straight ahead. Not at anything specific, just ahead, with the focused non-expression of someone who'd learned that meeting people's eyes gave them ideas about starting conversations. Every person on that street found a reason to be somewhere else. Not quickly, nothing that obvious, just a general drifting. A woman pulled her child closer and moved toward the far boardwalk. The 2 men talking outside the feed store turned and went inside. A dog that had been sleeping in the middle of the street lifted its head, reconsidered, and relocated to beneath the porch of the nearest building. The man walked through all of it like he was used to it, like he'd stopped noticing it years ago. Alara watched him. He stopped at the freight window to collect what appeared to be supplies, a bundle of something wrapped in canvas, a small crate, and exchanged 3 words with the freight clerk, who answered with 4 and then very carefully did not watch as the man walked away. "That's Gideon Voss," said a voice beside her. She turned. A girl of about 12 stood a few feet away, bundled into a coat 2 sizes too large, eating something from a paper wrapper with the concentrated attention of the young. "I figured," Alara said. She'd heard the name twice in the last 3 towns. "He killed a man once," the girl said, with the casual certainty of someone reciting established fact. "Maybe more than one. Nobody knows for sure because nobody asks." "Who told you that?" The girl considered. "Everyone." "Did everyone see it happen?" "Well, no." "Then everyone might be wrong." The girl looked at her with the particular expression children use when an adult says something they find technically possible but experientially unlikely. Then she went back to eating whatever was in the paper wrapper and drifted away. Alara looked back toward where Gideon Voss had been. He was already gone, disappeared somewhere between the freight yard and wherever he was going with the same lack of fanfare as he'd arrived. She stood there for a moment, in the cold street with the storm sky pressing down overhead, and made a decision that she'd been turning over since before she arrived in Blackstone Ridge. The decision that she needed a guide who knew the Northridge trails in winter conditions. The decision that, from everything she'd been able to learn in the last 6 weeks of searching for her brother, there was exactly one person in this territory who knew those mountains well enough to get someone in and out alive. The problem wasn't the cold. The problem wasn't even the mountains. The problem was convincing Gideon Voss to go back up there. She found him 2 hours later. He was at the far edge of the livery yard, loading his supplies onto a mule with the methodical precision of someone who'd done it 10,000 times and had opinions about how it should be done that he'd arrived at through experience rather than instruction. He didn't look up when she approached. "I need to hire a guide," Alara said. She stopped about 8 feet away. close enough to make it clear she wasn't going to conduct the conversation at a safe distance, far enough that she wasn't trying to crowd him. Someone who knows the North Ridge, the Caldwell Pass area, the trails above the timberline. Nothing. He kept working the mule's pack straps with the same focused attention. I was told you know those mountains better than anyone in the territory. Who told you that? His voice was low and slightly rough, like something that didn't get used as often as it should. Not unfriendly, just stripped of everything decorative. A trapper named Howell, out of Denison. A supply runner named Cassius who works the Blackwood route. And a woman in Redstone who said you brought her husband's body down from the upper ridge in a storm 3 years ago when everyone else said it couldn't be done. A pause. He didn't stop working. She didn't pay me for that. I will. Whatever's fair. It's not about the money. Then what's it about? He finally looked at her. The look was brief and direct, taking in her face, the set of her shoulders, the worn quality of her coat. And then he went back to the mule. It's about not dying, he said. Season like this, those trails are dangerous. I've got no business taking someone up there who doesn't know what they're walking into. My brother is up there. That stopped him, not dramatically. He didn't freeze or turn around, just slowed for a fraction of a second before continuing. When did he go up? Best I can figure, he was in this area about 6 weeks ago. He was investigating the land survey activity near Caldwell Pass. He sent me a letter from here saying he'd found something. Something about the way the syndicate was marking parcels that didn't match the actual claim boundaries. He said he was going to look closer. She paused. That was the last I heard. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He finished adjusting the pack strap, tested the mule's load with a practiced shake, and straightened up. The syndicate, he said. The way he said it wasn't a question. You know something about them. I know they've been active on the North Ridge for the better part of 2 years. I know 3 homesteaders in the Upper Valley moved out last spring in what everyone called voluntary. He looked at her again, longer this time. I know what voluntary looks like up here, and that wasn't it. Then you understand why I need to get up there. I understand why you want to. He picked up a length of rope and began coiling it. I also understand that the trails above the timberline are going to be impassable inside of 48 hours if that storm comes in the way it looks like it's coming in, which means if we go up now, and we don't come down until it breaks, which could be a week. I understand that. Do you? He stopped coiling the rope and turned to face her properly for the first time. Up close, he was even larger than she'd registered from a distance. Not just tall, but fundamentally substantial, built in layers, like the mountain itself. The scars on his face were older than she'd expected. Because most people who say they understand it haven't spent 4 nights above 8,000 feet in a winter storm. It's not camping. It's not adventurous. It's cold enough that your fingers stop working in ways that don't come back. It's dark enough that you can't see the drop-off until you're already falling. My brother is up there, Alara said again. She didn't say it loudly. She didn't put anything particular into it. She just said it, flat and clear, as a complete statement. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he went back to the rope. Be back here in an hour, he said. Wear everything warm you own. If you've got it doubled up, wear it doubled up. Feet most important. If your feet go, everything goes. You got good boots? Good enough. That's not the same as good. They'll do. He made a sound that might have been skepticism or might have been something else. 1 hour, he said, and you don't argue with what I tell you up there. Doesn't matter if it sounds wrong to you. Doesn't matter what your instincts are telling you. In the mountains in a storm, my word is the only rule that keeps you alive. That's the deal. Agreed. He nodded once, brief and final, and went back to his work. Word got around the way word always got around in small towns, which is to say, immediately. By the time Alara returned to the livery an hour later, having acquired an additional wool underlayer from the dry goods store and changed into her heavier socks, there were 5 people standing in various positions that attempted to look casual and failed. The barkeep from the saloon, the woman who'd been sweeping, 2 men she didn't recognize, and the freight clerk, who was technically still at work but had positioned himself at the very edge of his window. A man she hadn't met yet intercepted her before she reached the yard. He was perhaps 50, with the bearing of someone who'd once been important and hadn't entirely stopped considering himself so. Tall, thinning gray hair, a coat that was better quality than anything else in the street. Miss Quinn, he seemed to know her name already, which she noted. I'm Gerald Marsh. I run the settlement council here. He paused to allow this to register. I understand you're planning to head into the mountains with Gideon Voss. That's right. I'd encourage you to reconsider. I appreciate the concern. I'm not sure you understand what I'm saying. He moved slightly, not quite blocking her path, but adjusting his position in a way that was meant to slow her down. Gideon Voss is not a man you can trust. Whatever he's told you, he hasn't told me much of anything. Whatever impression he's given you, you need to understand that there are things about that man's history that would concern anyone with sense. He's been involved in— Marsh paused, selecting the word carefully. Incidents. Violent incidents. The kind that don't get reported properly because of where they happened and who was involved. But do you have specifics? The pause was just long enough to be informative. There are accounts? From who? From people who've dealt with him over the years. Names? Marsh's expression shifted slightly. I don't think that's— I'm asking a direct question, Alara said. If there are specific documented incidents involving Gideon Voss, I'd like to know what they are and who witnessed them. If there aren't, I'd appreciate you saying so and letting me get on with what I need to do. A silence. Marsh looked at her with something that might have been irritation and might have been something more complicated. You're making a mistake, he said finally. Maybe, she said, but it's mine to make. She walked past him into the yard. Gideon was ready. He had reorganized his pack since she'd last seen him and added to it. She could see the top of a rolled canvas shelter protruding from the back, an additional rope. He had 2 horses readied now, not the mule. He looked at her coat and her boots and her bag without comment. Who was that? He said, not looking at Marsh, who was still visible at the entrance to the yard. He said he runs the settlement council. Name of Marsh. Something moved across Gideon's face, too quick to read clearly. Gerald Marsh. You know him. I know of him. He handed her the reins of the second horse. He say anything worth hearing? He told me you were dangerous and I shouldn't trust you. Gideon looked at her then, with that same brief, direct look that seemed to be his version of sustained eye contact. He's not entirely wrong about the dangerous part, he said. I didn't say I was confused about that. He made the sound again, the one that might have been something. Then he mounted, and Alara mounted, and they rode out of the livery yard in the thin gray light of mid-afternoon, heading north. The people watching them go said nothing. Alara didn't look back. The town disappeared behind them in under 20 minutes, swallowed by the tree line and the rising grade of the trail. The temperature dropped as they climbed. Within the first mile, the scattered pines that had bordered the upper edge of Blackstone Ridge thickened into proper forest. Douglas fir and Engelmann spruce, dark and dense, closing over the trail until the sky was visible only in a narrow strip overhead. Gideon set a pace that wasn't slow, but wasn't punishing. She noted that he seemed to be reading the terrain as they moved. Not the obvious stuff, the trail itself, but the subtler things, the way the snow lay against tree bases, the angle of dead branches, small indicators she couldn't interpret but watched him absorb. He didn't talk. She didn't push it. She had questions, plenty of them, but she understood on some functional level that the time for questions wasn't when the man who knew where the hidden ice was needed to be paying attention to the hidden ice. An hour in, he stopped without warning. She pulled up beside him. He was looking at the trail ahead, which curved around a rock outcropping and disappeared. There was nothing obviously different about the section he was looking at. The snow looked the same. The trees looked the same. "What is it?" she said quietly. He didn't answer immediately. Then, "Someone came through here. Probably 3-4 weeks ago." She looked at the trail. "How can you tell?" "The way the snow settled around those tree roots." He indicated a cluster of roots near the trail edge that she would not have glanced at twice. Something compressed the ground underneath before the last heavy snow. Something roughly the size of a loaded pack horse. Could be anyone. Could be. He looked at the trail for another moment. Your brother? Did he have a horse or a mule? Horse? Bay gelding, kind of unremarkable. He called him Stamp. Gideon nodded slightly, not commenting. He nudged his horse forward, and they continued. The light was dropping faster now, and the clouds had come in completely. No more gray strip overhead, just a uniform pewter ceiling that sat low over the peaks. The temperature was still falling. Alara could feel it through her doubled-up layers, working at the edges. How bad is it going to get? She said. Bad enough. He glanced at the sky. We'll make shelter before full dark. There's a cut in the rock about another 2 miles up. It's been there long enough that I've used it before, won't collapse. Small, but it'll do. You know this trail well. I've walked it enough. Do you live up here? In the mountains, I mean. People in town seem to think I have a cabin. He said it without elaboration, as if the existence of the cabin answered whatever the rest of the question might have been. She waited. He didn't add anything. The people in town, she said. How long have they felt that way about you? A pause. She thought he might not answer, and then he did, with the same stripped quality as everything else he said. Long enough that I stopped keeping track. Did something happen? Or was it always, nothing happened? His voice had an edge now, not hostile, but definitive. That's the point. Nothing happened. They decided what I was before I ever gave them a reason. And once people decide something, they find the reasons after. That's just how it works. Alara was quiet for a moment. That's true, she said. He glanced at her. The glance lasted a fraction of a second longer than the ones before. It happened to you? He said. She thought about it. Different kind, she said. Not fear. More like dismissal. You're too big. You're too direct. You don't behave the way they expect, so they put you in a category and leave you there. She paused. Doesn't matter what you do after that. You're already filed. He said nothing, but she had the sense, not quite definable, that something had shifted slightly, like a door that had been latched was now just closed. The shelter he'd mentioned turned out to be a natural overhang in a granite face, deep enough for 2 people and the horses in a pinch, with a low stone lip at the front that he had apparently reinforced with stacked rocks on previous visits. He built a fire with an efficiency that looked effortless and wasn't. She watched him work and recognized the accumulated knowledge in every small decision, the placement of the initial kindling, the way he shielded the first flame from the wind with his body until it had enough going to defend itself. The fire changed the space, not just the temperature, the quality of the air, the sense of proportion. The overhang became something almost habitable. They ate in relative silence, dried meat and hard biscuit from her pack, supplemented by something he produced from his own that turned out to be a dense, dark-pressed cake of dried fruit and grain that tasted surprisingly good. What is that? She said. I make it. Good for cold weather. Dense. Doesn't freeze solid. Enough fat to keep you moving. She ate 3 pieces. He didn't comment. Outside, the wind had picked up. The storm was arriving ahead of schedule, which neither of them mentioned because there was nothing useful to say about it. Tell me about your brother, he said. She looked up. He was watching the fire, not her. What do you want to know? What was he doing up here? Not the claim investigation. You said he found something about the syndicate survey. What specifically? She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper. Not the letter. She'd read the letter so many times she didn't need to look at it anymore. This was a different document, one she'd assembled herself from fragments of information gathered over 6 weeks. The Caldwell Land Syndicate has been operating in this territory for about 3 years, she said. They acquire land claims, though, sometimes through purchase, sometimes through what they call distressed acquisition, which, as far as I can tell, means they make circumstances distressed and then acquire. They've got legal backing from somewhere. I don't know exactly where yet. And they've been marking survey boundaries that don't match the original federal land grants. What does that mean practically? It means they're claiming more land than they're entitled to, specifically the water rights that come with it. If you control the water in a valley like this, you control the valley. And everyone in it. He nodded. The fire snapped. Outside, the wind was doing something dramatic against the rock face above them. Thomas figured this out from the survey documents. He's a surveyor, freelance. He does work for land offices and private parties. He was doing a standard verification survey for a homesteader family named Keller up in the Upper Valley, and the numbers didn't match. He went looking for why, and the trail led to the syndicate. Gideon was quiet for a moment. The Keller family moved out in March. Elara looked at him. Voluntarily? Winifred Keller cried for 3 days before they left. Not what crying from relief looks like. Do you know where they went? South. Redstone, maybe. He shifted slightly. There were 4 other families in the Upper Valley who moved out inside a year, all of them after the syndicate started marking boundaries up there. One of them, a man named Taft, had been working that land for 11 years. None of them reported anything. Who would they report to? It wasn't quite sarcastic, just flat and specific. Marsh runs the Settlement Council. The nearest federal land office is 4 days' ride. By the time anyone gets there and back, whatever was claimed gets filed, and filed documents have weight that oral complaints don't. Elara folded the paper and put it back in her coat. Thomas was going to document it, survey the actual boundaries himself, match them against the original grants, and take the discrepancy to the federal office. Ambitious. Stupid, probably, but that's Thomas. She paused. He's 24. He still thinks the right thing done correctly is enough. Gideon said nothing to that. He looked at the fire with an expression she couldn't read, and she had the sense, not for the last time, that he was thinking something he'd decided there was no point in saying. Did you know, she said carefully, that Marsh is connected to the syndicate? A beat. I know he's connected to something that benefits from the valley staying unsettled. Beyond that, I haven't had much occasion to dig. He came out to warn me off of you specifically, not just the mountains, you. That would be because I've been on those trails and I know what's up there. He said it without apparent emotion. If your brother found what you're saying he found, I'm one of the people who might be able to confirm it. Marsh would know that. So warning me away from you was useful, he said. Yes. The fire settled into a steadier rhythm as the wind outside reached full voice. The horses, tucked in close to the rock wall, were calm enough. Elara pulled her coat tighter and looked at the man across the fire. The enormous, scarred, relentlessly quiet man that an entire town had decided was a monster and who was currently carefully feeding a measured amount of wood to a fire so that it would burn optimally through the night. Gideon, she said. He looked up. Thank you for coming. He looked at her for a moment, not with the brief efficiency of his usual glances, just steadily for a moment, like he was deciding something about her. Don't thank me yet, he said. He went back to the fire. Outside, the storm hit in earnest. By morning, the world had contracted to white. She woke to Gideon already at the fire's edge, not stoking it, but studying the gray light at the shelter's mouth with the focused attention of someone reading a language she didn't speak. How bad, she said, sitting up and accepting the inevitability of the cold. Bad, but moving. He handed her the pressed cake without being asked. Storm's running east faster than I thought. If it stays on this track, we'll have a window by mid-afternoon. And if it doesn't stay on this track, then we sit here another day. She ate. He went back to watching the weather with the patience of a man who'd spent a lot of his life in places where patience wasn't optional. Can I ask you something? She said. You're going to regardless. Probably. She paused. The woman in Redstone, the one whose husband's body you brought down. She said you carried him for 2 days. He said nothing. That's not nothing, she said. That's not what a dangerous man does. Dangerous men do all kinds of things, he said. Don't confuse specific acts with character. I'm not. I'm noticing a pattern. He turned from the shelter mouth and looked at her. It was the longest he'd looked at her yet, and she held it without flinching. You don't know me, he said. You've been in my company for 1 evening. I know you built that fire the way someone builds a fire who's kept other people alive with fires, she said. I know you checked the horses twice in the night. I heard you. I know you gave me the pressed cake without asking if I was hungry because you noticed I'd packed light and decided I needed more than I'd packed. A silence. The wind outside was still vocal, but had lost some of its earlier intensity. Observant, he said. Necessary, she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. Something that moved in the direction of a smile and then stopped, like it had forgotten the rest of the route. But something. He turned back to the weather. Your brother's still up there, he said. I'd have heard if someone came down from the North Ridge in the last 6 weeks. I get through the territory enough to hear things. He paused. There's a cabin in the upper valley, been abandoned for 2 years, last occupied by a homesteader who left before the others. It's the kind of place someone would use if they needed to stay out of sight. Elara sat very still. You think he's there? I think it's worth looking. And if it's being watched, then we approach carefully. He finally pulled his gaze from the weather and picked up his own portion of the pressed cake. There's more than one way up to the upper valley. The main trail's the obvious one. There's a secondary route that comes in from the west. Takes longer, adds half a day, but it's unlikely anyone's watching it because it's genuinely hard to find if you don't know what you're looking for. You know what you're looking for. I do. She looked at him across the dying fire in the cold gray shelter morning. This man that an entire town had spent years filing under monster, and felt something settle in her chest. Not comfort, exactly. Not certainty. Just a specific quality of stillness that came from being in the presence of someone who actually knew what they were doing and wasn't pretending otherwise. Mid-afternoon, then, she said. Mid-afternoon, he agreed. Outside, the storm was still talking, but it was moving east, same as he'd said, same as he'd read from things she hadn't seen. She believed him about that. About all of it. She believed him in the specific way you believe a mountain. Not because it's comforting, but because it's simply and thoroughly there, and the alternative to believing in it doesn't bear much thinking about. They waited for the window. The window Gideon had predicted came at 2:30 in the afternoon. Not a clearing exactly, more like the storm exhaling before it decided what to do next. The wind dropped from a roar to something manageable, and the snow thinned from a solid wall to scattered curtains that moved across the slope in waves. He was already breaking camp when Elara woke from a short, uncomfortable sleep against the rock wall, her neck stiff and her left foot numb from where she'd been sitting on it without realizing. 20 minutes, he said, without turning around. She got up and got moving. The numbness in her foot resolved itself into pins and needles as she stamped around the shelter, and she ate the last of the pressed cake from the night before and drank cold water from a canteen that had been sitting far enough from the fire to be genuinely unpleasant. None of this was pleasant. That was fine. Pleasant wasn't the point. They were on the trail by 3, moving north through a forest that had been silenced by the snow into something that felt almost held. The horses moved carefully on the packed surface, picking their footing with the practiced instinct of animals that had done this before. Gideon rode slightly ahead, not fast, reading the trail the way he'd been reading it since they left Blackstone Ridge, that steady absorption of small signals that Elara had been watching and still couldn't fully decode. The secondary route he'd mentioned turned out to branch from the main trail at a point she would have walked past without a second glance, a slight depression in the tree line, 2 stones placed at an angle that might have been accidental and weren't. He turned without marking the turn with any particular gesture, and she followed, and the main trail disappeared behind them as the trees closed in. This route was harder. The grade was steeper and the footing less predictable, and in 2 places they had to dismount and lead the horses through sections where the snow had drifted deep against the slope. Elara's knee made its displeasure known at both of these sections, and she ignored it both times, though by the second time ignoring it required some concentration. Gideon noticed. She saw him register her gait when she remounted the second time. Just a glance, brief and downward, at her right leg. "It'll hold," she said, before he could say anything. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were thinking it." "I was thinking that we've got about 90 minutes of usable light left and the cabin's still 40 minutes out." He nudged his horse forward. "Keep up." She kept up. The upper valley opened ahead of them gradually, the dense trees giving way to a more open slope with the valley floor visible below, white and flat and still, with the dark line of a frozen creek cutting through the middle of it. It was genuinely beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they're also dangerous, and Alara registered it and kept moving. The abandoned cabin sat at the valley's north edge, backed against a granite shelf that shielded it from the worst of the north wind. From a distance, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to look like. Unused, half-buried, the kind of structure that had given up on itself and was waiting for the weather to finish the job. Two of the shutters were loose. Snow had drifted deep against the south wall, but there was a horse in the lean-to shelter on the eastern side, not visible from the main approach, only visible from the angle they were coming in at, on the secondary route. Alara saw it at the same moment Gideon stopped. "Bay Gelding," he said. She was already off her horse. He caught her arm. Not roughly, just firmly, with a grip that stopped her forward motion without jerking. "Slow," he said. "We don't know who else is here." She understood that. She did. But the horse in the lean-to had a blaze on its forehead that she'd have recognized in a line of 100 horses, and keeping herself to a walk across the last 100 yards of snow was the hardest thing she'd done since leaving Blackstone Ridge. They approached from the eastern side, using the granite shelf as partial cover. Gideon dismounted at 50 yards and indicated she should do the same, and they covered the rest of the distance on foot, leading the horses. No lights in the cabin windows, no smoke from the chimney, both of which could mean empty and could mean something else. He stopped at the cabin's east wall and listened. Alara listened too, though she wasn't sure what she was listening for. Wind. The horse in the lean-to shifting weight. Silence everywhere else. Gideon moved to the door and knocked. 3 times, measured, not loud. Nothing. He knocked again. A sound from inside. Movement, slow and careful, and then a voice, rough with cold or disuse or both. "Who is it?" Alara closed her eyes for half a second. "My name is Gideon Voss," Gideon said. "I'm with your sister." The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then the door opened. Thomas Quinn looked terrible. That was the first thing and the most honest thing. He was pale in the way that spoke of not enough food for too many days, and he had the beginnings of frostbite coloring the tips of 2 fingers on his right hand, and there was a gash above his left eyebrow that had been cleaned badly and was healing in the crooked way that meant it hadn't been cleaned well enough. He was wearing everything he owned, layered, and still looked cold. He was also, and this registered in the same moment as everything else, alive and standing and recognizably himself, which was the only thing that actually mattered. Alara walked into the cabin and put both arms around her brother and held on. He made an involuntary sound that was something between surprise and relief, and then hugged her back with the grip of someone who'd been alone for a long time. "You shouldn't be here," he said into her hair. "It's not safe. I know it's not safe. I've been looking for you for 6 weeks. 6? He pulled back and looked at her. "How did you even find—" "I'm very stubborn." She looked at his fingers. "What happened to your hand?" "Lost a glove crossing the East Ridge. It's fine, mostly. I've been keeping it wrapped." He looked past her at Gideon, who had come inside and shut the door and was currently assessing the cabin's interior with the same systematic attention he'd been applying to trail conditions since they left town. "You're Gideon Voss?" "Yes." "I've heard of you." Thomas said it in the straightforward way of someone who was stating a fact before deciding how to contextualize it. "Most people have." "The people who mentioned you didn't." Thomas stopped, reconsidered. "They weren't complimentary." "They usually aren't, for what it's worth," Thomas said. "Those particular people were Gerald Marsh and 2 men I've since figured out work for the syndicate, so I'm not sure their opinions should carry much weight." Something shifted in Gideon's expression, not visibly, just a slight change in the quality of his stillness. "You ran into Marsh up here?" "He came up the main trail about a week after I started documenting the boundaries. 3 men with him, armed. I got out through the back before they saw me, but I lost most of my food supply in the process, and my notes." Thomas's jaw tightened. "They took my field survey notes, the originals. I still have the copies I made, but the originals were in my saddlebag and they got them." "What's in the copies?" Alara said. "Enough. Not as clean, but enough to show the discrepancy between the syndicate's claimed boundaries and the original federal grants. The water rights they're claiming extend 3 miles further east than the actual grant allows. 3 miles doesn't sound like much, but it covers the main tributary that feeds the whole upper valley. He moved to the corner of the cabin where a pack sat against the wall and crouched over it, digging through until he found a wrapped bundle of papers. Everything's here. Survey measurements, coordinates, the original grant numbers cross-referenced. Gideon crossed the cabin and looked at the papers without touching them. He looked for a long moment. You measured this yourself? Every marker. Took me 11 days. Thomas glanced at him. I'm a licensed surveyor. I know what I'm looking at. I'm not questioning it. I'm thinking about what it means to move these documents to the Federal Land Office before Marsh can do anything about them. He straightened. How many men does he have working up here? I counted 6 over the week I was watching before they found me. Could be more. They're running a base camp somewhere off the North Spur. I didn't get close enough to see the full setup, but there's equipment up there. Blasting equipment, I think. The kind you'd use for clearing rock. The room went quiet. Alara looked at her brother. He looked back at her with an expression that confirmed she was thinking the same thing. Blasting equipment, Gideon said. His voice had gone flat in a specific way. Where on the North Spur? Above the main trail. Maybe 1,000 feet above the valley floor. Thomas looked at him carefully. Why? Because the North Spur is directly above the main supply route, the one that connects Blackstone Ridge to every settlement in the upper valley. Gideon moved to the cabin's single north-facing window, which had a shutter pulled partway across it, and looked through the gap at the slope above. If they bring down enough rock in the right place, they cut off the valley, Alara said. They cut off the valley, they cut off any chance of those documents getting out in a timely way, and they create an emergency that takes every available person in Blackstone Ridge 3 days to deal with before anyone starts asking questions about land grants. He turned from the window. Marsh is smarter than I gave him credit for. When? Thomas said. Storm's going to break clean in the morning. After that, clear skies for probably 4 days. If I were him, that's when I'd do it. No weather interference, trails clear enough to manage the aftermath on his terms. He looked at them both. Which means we have tonight. Thomas stood up. He was steadier than he'd looked at the door, Alara thought. The particular steadiness of someone who'd been scared and tired for a long time and had just been handed a reason to focus. What are we doing tonight? Getting those documents to someone who can hold them, and then dealing with whatever's on that spur before it comes down on the valley. Gideon picked up his coat from the bench where he'd set it. Is there anyone in Blackstone Ridge you trust? Anyone Marsh doesn't own? Thomas and Alara looked at each other. The freight clerk, Alara said slowly. He reacted when I mentioned the syndicate, but he didn't report back to Marsh. He had time, but nothing came of it. Name? I didn't get his name. Young, Thomas said. Red hair. He was decent to me when I passed through on my way up. Name's Arlo, I think. Gideon thought about it. Arlo Petch. He's been in Blackstone Ridge 3 years. No connection to the syndicate that I've seen. He looked at Thomas. Can you ride? I can ride. Your hands? Thomas flexed his right hand and kept his expression neutral while doing it. Alara saw the slight tightening at the corner of his eye and filed it without commenting. Thomas caught her seeing it and gave her a look that said plainly, Don't. She didn't. I can ride, he said again. They left the cabin 20 minutes later, Thomas on stamp with the documents wrapped in oilcloth inside his coat. The sky overhead had cleared enough to show stars in the gaps between the remaining clouds, and the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that arrived after storms and was in some ways more serious than the storm itself. Still, dry, absolute. Every footfall in the snow was audible in the silence. Gideon led them south on the secondary route, moving at a faster pace than the afternoon climb had allowed. The horses found their footing in the dark with a confidence that Alara was grateful for because she couldn't see much herself. She rode close enough to keep Gideon's shape visible against the snow and kept Thomas in her peripheral vision on the right. She had 1,000 things she wanted to say to her brother. She'd had 6 weeks to compose them. She kept all of them for later. About a mile down the secondary route, Gideon stopped again. He held up a hand. She and Thomas pulled up. The sound came from downslope to the west. Not the wind. Movement. More than one person. Boots in snow. The creak of equipment. Gideon turned his horse off the route entirely, moving into the tree line with a silence that struck her as remarkable given the size of him and his horse both. She followed. Thomas came up last, and they stood in the dark among the firs and waited. 3 men came up the main trail below them, visible in the moonlight that had broken through the cloud gap. Armed, moving with purpose, 2 carrying something between them on a frame. She couldn't make out what, only the shape. The 3rd man walked ahead, and even at this distance, in the dark, she recognized the coat and the bearing. Marsh. Thomas made a sound that was barely a breath. She reached over and put her hand on his arm without looking at him. They waited until the 3 figures had moved well past and the sound of their passage had faded. Gideon turned to look at her in the dark. She couldn't fully read his expression, but she could read the shape of it, the particular set of a man recalculating. "Sooner than I thought," he said very quietly. "How much sooner?" "Could be tonight." He looked upslope toward the north spur, which was invisible in the dark above the tree line, but which Alara could feel the presence of. That quality that ridgelines have of being somewhere above you even when you can't see them. If they're moving equipment up after dark, they're not waiting for morning. Thomas had his hand inside his coat, over the documents, an unconscious gesture. "We need to split up." Gideon looked at him. "She takes the documents down to Blackstone Ridge," Thomas said. "Finds Arlo Petch, gets them into his hands, or hands them to someone who can ride for the federal office. You and I go up and find out what they're actually planning up there." "No," Alara said. "Alara sos... No." She kept her voice low but didn't soften it. "I am not riding back down that trail alone while you go toward whatever Marsh is setting up on that ridge. That's not the arrangement. The arrangement is getting those documents out. Then we all go down and we all come back up. We don't have time. Then we find a 3rd option." She looked at Gideon. "What's the 3rd option?" He was quiet for a moment. She could almost see him working it. The trail layouts, the distances, the timing, the 3 of them, and what each of them could and couldn't do. "There's a homestead at the base of the South Trail," he said. "It's occupied, family named Briggs. They've been there since before the syndicate started operations. The husband will ride." He looked at Thomas. "You give the documents to Briggs. He knows the route to the federal office. He's made it twice. He goes south tonight." Thomas absorbed this. "And us?" "We go up." Gideon looked at Alara when he said it, not at Thomas, not challenging her, just being clear about what he was including her in. She held the look. "All 3 of us." "All 3 of us," he confirmed. Thomas let out a breath that steamed in the cold air and made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I've been up here alone for 3 weeks," he said, "eating terrible food and hiding from armed men and thinking no one was coming. And now I've got my sister and a man the whole territory is afraid of, and we're going back up the mountain in the dark." Neither of them said anything. "All right," Thomas said, "let's go find Briggs." They moved south through the trees, in the dark, in the cold, with Marsh somewhere above them and the sound of what he was planning still echoing in the silence of the mountain. The Briggs homestead was dark when they reached it, which meant nothing except that sensible people were asleep at this hour. Gideon dismounted at the fence line and walked to the door alone, which Alara understood was deliberate. 3 strangers arriving at a homestead in the middle of the night was a different proposition than one known face arriving with 2 strangers behind him. He knocked, waited, knocked again. A light appeared in the window. Then the door opened 6 inches, held there by a man with a rifle and the expression of someone who'd learned caution the hard way and hadn't unlearned it. Gideon said something low that she couldn't hear from where she was standing. The door opened wider. 5 minutes later, Thomas was inside handing the oilcloth package to a broad, weathered man named Cal Briggs, who listened to the explanation with the concentrated silence of someone who understood the weight of what he was being given. His wife stood in the doorway of the back room with a lamp, not speaking, watching her husband's face. "Federal Land Office," Thomas said. "Ask for the chief surveyor. Not the clerk, the surveyor himself. His name is Aldred. Tell him it's a boundary fraud case in the Caldwell Pass territory and that the documentation is complete." Briggs looked at the package, then at Thomas, then at Gideon. "You trust this?" he said to Gideon. "I trust the survey work," Gideon said. "I trust what I've seen on that ridge for 2 years." Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then he handed the package to his wife without looking away from Gideon. "Keep that somewhere dry and not obvious," he said. She took it and disappeared without a word. "I'll leave before first light," Briggs said. They left him saddling his horse and went back up the mountain. The climb to the North Spur in the dark was the hardest physical thing Alara had done in recent memory, and her recent memory included 6 weeks of hard riding across winter territory. The secondary route that had been difficult in the afternoon was something else entirely at night. The footing invisible beneath the snow, the grade steep enough that her thighs burned with the sustained effort of not sliding backward. The cold so complete that it had stopped feeling like a sensation and started feeling like a condition, something she was inside rather than something happening to her skin. Thomas climbed beside her without complaint, which she respected more than she'd have said out loud. His right hand was wrapped tight inside his coat sleeve, and she could see from his movement that using it hurt, but he kept moving and kept pace. Gideon was ahead of them both, moving through the dark with the particular confidence of a man who'd walked this slope enough times that the darkness was less of an obstacle than a different kind of information. He stopped periodically to let them close the gap, and in those pauses he listened. That total stillness that she'd noticed at the shelter, the quality of absorbing rather than searching. At the tree line, he stopped and crouched. They came up beside him. Below the crest of the spur, maybe 200 yards upslope, there was light. Not a fire, a lamp, possibly two, shielded but not completely. And with the light came sound, voices, low, and the sound of metal on rock that she now recognized as the frame those men had been carrying. "How many do you think?" Thomas said, barely above a breath. "At least 4. Maybe 5. Gideon studied the light for a moment. "They're setting the charges on the east face of the spur. If they bring it down there, it takes out the trail at the narrowest point. That's where the valley access pinches to maybe 20 feet between the rock wall and the drop-off. Can we stop them from up here? Not by getting into a fight with 4 armed men in the dark? No." He turned to look at them both. "But there's another way." He explained it in short, spare sentences, the way he explained everything. No decoration, no hedging. The east face charges required a specific detonation sequence. The fuses had to be laid from the charge point down the slope to a position far enough back to be safe. That meant the fuse line ran across open ground for at least 50 feet. Cut the line, and the charges were useless until they reset, which took time they might not have once they knew someone was up here. "The fuse line will be on the downslope side," he said. "I can get to it." "In the dark, past 4 armed men," Thomas said. "You asked if there was a way. That's the way." "There has to be." "Thomas!" Alara put her hand briefly on her brother's arm. She looked at Gideon. "What do you need us to do? Stay here. Don't move. Don't make noise. If something goes wrong and men start coming down this slope toward you, you ride back down and you don't stop. And if something goes wrong with you..." He looked at her. In the dark, she could see his face only in broad strokes, the outline of him, the stillness. "Same answer," he said. She didn't like it. She let him go anyway because the alternative was arguing, and arguing cost time, and time was the one thing they didn't have enough of. He moved upslope, and the dark took him. What followed was the longest period of sustained stillness Alara could remember enduring. She and Thomas crouched in the snow at the tree line, close enough that she could feel the warmth from his arm, and they didn't speak, and they didn't move, and they watched the lamplight above them. The voices continued. She could hear them more clearly now, fragments without context. One man's voice more than the others, giving instructions. Marsh, probably, though she couldn't be certain. Thomas shifted weight once. She put her hand on his arm and he stopped. The minutes stretched. Then, from the east, farther east than the lamp position, farther east than she'd been tracking, there was a sound. Brief. Metal on rock, a single note followed by silence. Then a voice, sharp and raised, the specific tone of someone who'd heard something they weren't expecting. Movement above them. The lamp swung. "Someone's out there." Alara grabbed Thomas by the coat sleeve and pulled him down flat into the snow without thinking about it, and they lay there with the cold pressing against them and watched the lamplight move in arcs as men spread out from the charge position. She counted seconds, counted voices. Three distinct voices moving on the slope above, one staying near the equipment. She could hear the crunch of boots on the frozen crust moving east, away from them, toward where Gideon had gone. Then nothing for too long. Then a completely different sound, a short, hard collision of something large against something immovable, and a voice that cut off abruptly, and then the particular quality of silence that meant a situation had resolved itself in one direction or another. More voices, urgent now, two men instead of three, calling a name, receiving no answer. Thomas had his hand on her wrist. She realized she'd grabbed his arm again and hadn't let go. A figure came downslope out of the dark, moving fast and without particular care for noise. Alara came up onto one knee before she recognized the size of him, the specific way he moved through terrain, like the terrain was a problem he'd already solved and was merely navigating the solution. Gideon reached them and didn't stop, just gestured with one hand, forward and south, and they were moving before she'd made a conscious decision to move. "The fuse line?" she said, as they hit the tree line. "Cut." He was slightly out of breath, which was the first time she'd heard that. "They have another spool in the equipment cache, but it'll take them 20 minutes to rig it if they know what they're doing. We need to be at the bottom of this spur when they figure out what happened." "What about the man who—" "Sleeping." Thomas made a sound. "He's alive?" "I'm not in the habit of killing people," Gideon said. "He's going to have a headache. Keep moving." They moved. The descent was faster and rougher than the climb. Not careful, just committed, following Gideon's line down the slope through the trees with the specific faith of people who've decided that maintaining pace matters more than maintaining dignity. Alara went down on one knee at a root hidden under the snow and came back up without stopping. Thomas lost his footing on an iced section and caught himself on a tree branch with his bad hand and made a sound that he cut short immediately. Neither of them said anything about it. At the base of the spur, where the secondary route flattened out before turning south, Gideon stopped and listened. Above them, somewhere on the slope, there were voices, distant now, still agitated. "They'll come down the main trail when they regroup," he said. "Faster route, which means we have a window." He looked at them both, assessing quickly. "Thomas, how's the hand?" "Fine." "Really?" "It's functional enough. I can ride." Gideon looked at his face for a moment, then apparently decided the answer was sufficient. "We ride south to the junction, then east toward Blackstone Ridge. If Marsh comes down the main trail, we'll hear him before he sees us. Different route." "And when we get back to Blackstone Ridge," Alara said, "we get there first and we make noise." He looked at her directly. Not the quiet kind. She understood what he meant. Information had weight only when it moved, and it moved fastest when people were watching. They mounted and headed south. The ride back toward Blackstone Ridge took just under 2 hours, pushing the horses harder than was comfortable, and choosing the eastern approach that kept them off the main trail. By the time the tree line gave way to the open grade above town, the sky had shifted from black to that deep blue that came before dawn without yet being it. The temperature was at its lowest. Alara's hands had gone to a kind of numb that was less comfortable than actual feeling, and she kept flexing them around the reins to remind them what they were for. Thomas was flagging. She could see it in the way he was holding himself upright, deliberate, with maintenance, the way you carry yourself when your body has started negotiating. She didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say, and he would have disliked it anyway. Gideon had said nothing for the better part of an hour. He rode ahead of them, and she watched the set of his shoulders. That particular quality she'd been reading since the first day. The way tension showed in him not as agitation, but as a slight shift in posture, something going from controlled to contained. "You're thinking about Marsh," she said. He didn't turn around. "Marsh isn't going to stop because we cut a fuse line." "No. He's going to come back down that mountain and he's going to have a story. His story is going to be coherent, and it's going to have been in preparation for longer than our story has. He's the settlement council. He has standing. We have the survey documents. We have the survey documents moving south on a horse with Cal Briggs, who won't reach the federal office for at minimum 2 days." He paused. "A lot can happen in 2 days. Then we make sure the right things happen." She pulled up alongside him. "You said we make noise. Who's going to listen? You told me yourself that people in that town decided what you were before you gave them a reason." He was quiet for a long moment. The lights of Blackstone Ridge were visible now at the bottom of the grade, a few windows lit, the town beginning its slow emergence from the night. There are people in that town who lost land, he said. Families who moved out and some who are still there and have been watching it happen. They're afraid. Fear is not the same as loyalty. He looked at her. If they see something worth standing behind, some of them will stand. And if they don't, then we stand anyway, and we see what that produces. She looked at him, the hard, weathered profile of him in the pre-dawn light, the absolute unsentimentality in the way he said it. We stand anyway, not as inspiration, not as principle delivered for effect, just as the next step in a sequence of practical decisions. She thought about the 12-year-old girl in the street telling her Gideon Voss had killed a man. She thought about Gerald Marsh's careful warnings and the way he'd delivered them. Smooth, practiced, the warnings of a man who'd given them before and found them effective. She thought about the Keller family and Winifred Keller crying for 3 days before she left land she'd worked for years, and the 4 other families and whatever version of the story had circulated through Blackstone Ridge to explain their departures. They've been telling the wrong story about you for a long time, she said. He didn't answer immediately, then, very simply, yes. That's going to change. He looked at her again, the same quality of look as the shelter, not brief, not cataloging, just present. Maybe, he said. But the way he said it wasn't doubt. It was the word of a man who'd spent long enough not expecting things to change that the possibility of it required its own careful handling. They rode the last mile into Blackstone Ridge in the cold and the coming light, and by the time they reached the main street, the sun was beginning to color the eastern sky over the mountain peaks, pale and specific and entirely indifferent to what had happened on the slopes above, the way weather always was. Arlo Petch was at the freight window when they came in, which meant he'd been there early, and he looked up at the 3 of them arriving together in the dawn with the expression of a man who'd been expecting something and wasn't entirely sure he was prepared for what shape it had taken. Gideon dismounted and walked straight to him. "We need to talk," he said. Arlo Petch looked at him for a long moment. Then he opened the freight window wider and said, "Come in." It was a beginning. Arlo Petch's back office was barely large enough for the 4 of them. A desk, 2 chairs, a stove that hadn't been lit yet, and stacks of freight ledgers that occupied most of the remaining floor space. Thomas took one of the chairs because nobody offered it, and he looked like he needed it. Alara stood near the door. Gideon stood where there was room to stand, which was against the far wall, and Arlo stood behind his desk with his arms crossed and the expression of someone who'd been sitting on information for a while and was now doing the calculation of whether the moment had arrived to let it go. Gideon let him do the calculation. He didn't push. He'd learned years ago that pushing the wrong person at the wrong moment produced a closed door, and Arlo Petch was not the kind of man you wanted to push. "Marsh came through here 2 days ago," Arlo said finally. "Asked me to hold a freight shipment. Said there was a discrepancy in the paperwork and he needed time to sort it out. Shipment was medical supplies. Antibiotics, wound dressings, the kind of things you'd need to restock after a significant incident." "He was pre-positioning," Thomas said. "That's what I figured." Arlo uncrossed his arms and picked up a ledger from the desk, opened it to a page he'd clearly already identified. "I've been keeping track. Every time the syndicate had activity on the ridge, there's been a corresponding delay in supplies going up to the upper valley, 3 times in the last 8 months. Once the Kellers left, once the Taft family, once a smaller homesteader named Prentice." He looked at Gideon. "I didn't know what I had. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't have the shape of it." "Now you do," Gideon said. Arlo was quiet for a moment. Marsh has half this town in his pocket. The other half is afraid of what happens if they get on his wrong side. He set the ledger down. "What do you need from me?" "Witnesses," Alara said. "People who saw what happened to those families. People who can say what the conditions were when they left, that they didn't leave on their own terms." "Winifred Keller's sister is still in town," Arlo said. "She never left. Name is Ruth Corman. She runs the dry goods counter. She watched her sister pack up, and she's had opinions about it ever since that she has been very careful not to say out loud in the wrong company." "Will she talk now?" "That depends on whether she thinks talking is going to accomplish something or just get her hurt. Gideon looked at him directly. Then we need to make sure it accomplishes something before we ask her to take the risk. Arlo nodded once. It was the nod of a man who'd made a decision and knew he'd have to live with it regardless of how it landed. What's your timeline? Marsh comes down from the ridge. He comes here, Gideon said. He has a story prepared. We need to have already told ours before he gets to tell his. That means this morning. Arlo looked at the window. The dawn light strengthening outside, the street still empty. I can have Ruth here in 20 minutes, he paused. There's also the Hendricks brothers. They hauled for the syndicate last spring and quit when they figured out what they were hauling. They've been keeping their heads down, but they're not happy about it. Get them too. Arlo took his coat off the hook by the door and stopped with his hand on the door. He looked at Gideon with the particular expression of someone asking a question they've been not asking for a long time. Those things they say about you, he said. I want to ask straight. Ask? Are any of them true? Gideon considered it. I've done things worth being cautious about, he said. I haven't done what they say I've done. The specific things, the killing, the incidents Marsh describes, those are his stories, not mine. Arlo held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, the same decided nod as before. All right, he said, and went out. Thomas was asleep in the chair within 4 minutes of Arlo leaving. Not the careful sleep of someone resting on purpose, but the sudden involuntary unconsciousness of a body that had reached its limit and stopped negotiating. Alara looked at him, her little brother with the frostbite on his fingers and the badly healed gash and 3 weeks of mountain survival worn into his face, and felt something tighten in her chest that she didn't let herself spend time with. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at Thomas with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something in it that wasn't quite softness, but wasn't its opposite either. He did well up there, Gideon said, quietly, so as not to wake him. He's stubborn, she said. It looks like competence from a distance. Most useful things do. She looked at him. He was still watching Thomas with that complicated, unnameable expression. You're doing it again, she said. Doing what? Thinking something you've decided not to say. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite the almost smile from the shelter, but in the same direction. I was thinking that he came up here alone with survey equipment and a theory, and spent 3 weeks documenting a criminal enterprise run by armed men while hiding in an abandoned cabin. That's not just stubborn. No, she agreed. It's also 24 and not knowing yet how badly things can go. Maybe. He looked at her now. Or maybe it's knowing and going anyway. She didn't have an answer for that, and she thought he probably hadn't expected one. Ruth Corman arrived with a wool scarf pulled up to her ears and the expression of a woman who'd been preparing herself for something on the walk over and hadn't entirely finished preparing. She was perhaps 40, with the practical, weathered look of someone who'd been working hard in a harsh place for a long time and had stopped making apologies for how that looked. She sat in the chair Alara offered her and looked at Gideon with an assessment that was direct and slightly startled and then settled into something more considered. I know who you are, she said to him. Most people do. My sister spoke well of you, years ago, before... She stopped. Winifred said you helped them mark their upper boundary when they first arrived. Didn't charge for it. Gideon said nothing. She also said Marsh told her when they were being pushed out that you'd sold information about their claim to the syndicate. Ruth's voice was steady. That you'd told them where the best water access was and how many hands they had. The room went quiet. Alara watched Gideon's face. She watched it very carefully. What she saw was not anger and not denial. What she saw was the specific expression of a man who'd heard this before and had long since processed it into something he carried as fact about the world rather than as injury. He told others the same thing, Gideon said. Different details, same structure. Man who can't be trusted, history of betrayal. It's easier to isolate someone with that story than with a simpler one. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. She believed him. She felt terrible about it. A pause. She cried for days before they left. Not just about the land. I know, he said. Ruth's jaw tightened briefly, and then she looked at Alara with the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long they've stopped noticing it as separate from themselves, and has just been reminded that it's there and that it's heavy. "What do you need me to say?" she said. By the time Marsh rode into Blackstone Ridge at 8:30 in the morning, Arlo's back office had become something between a meeting room and a war council. The Hendricks brothers, two large, taciturn men who looked enough alike to be mistaken for twins, though they weren't, had confirmed in detail what they'd been hauling for the syndicate: blasting materials, fuse line, survey stakes with the syndicate's marks already notched into them, positioned at boundaries that didn't match any federal document they'd ever seen. They'd quit, they said, when they understood what the stakes meant. One of them, the older one named Deckard, had kept a single stake as evidence, a thing he'd apparently been uncertain about for months, and produced from his coat pocket with the expression of a man who'd been hoping someone would eventually ask for it. There were others. A woman named Forsyth, whose husband had been warned off his claim by two of Marsh's men and hadn't reported it because reporting meant writing to the federal office and leaving his family alone for a week, which was the same calculation that had kept everyone quiet. The freight ledger Arlo had been keeping, every delayed shipment annotated. Ruth Corman's account of her sister's departure, given in the flat, careful language of someone making certain every word was accurate. It wasn't a flood. People in small, frightened communities don't flood. They come in ones and then twos and then a few more, each one watching the ones before them and deciding whether the ground is solid enough to step onto. It was enough. Gideon stood through most of it and said very little. He answered direct questions when they were asked and let the rest of it happen without trying to direct it. Alara noticed, from the way he held himself during those hours, slightly apart, mostly quiet, steady in a way that wasn't performance, that this was not unfamiliar territory. Not the gathering of witnesses, but the position of being the person in the room that people were watching to see if it was safe to proceed. He was used to being watched. He was less used to being watched by people who weren't afraid. Marsh came in through the freight office main door at 8:30 and walked to the counter with the confidence of a man who owned the room and hadn't yet been told otherwise. Arlo was behind the counter. He said, "Gerald," in a tone that was not quite neutral. Marsh registered the tone, and his eyes moved to the back office door, which was open. He looked inside. He took in the people there: Ruth Corman, the Hendricks brothers, Alara, Gideon, Thomas, who had woken up and was sitting upright and watchful. And his face went through a rapid internal rearrangement that he managed well but not perfectly. "Quite a gathering," he said. "Come in," Arlo said. Marsh came in. He was still moving with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to controlling the rooms he walked into, and for a moment, a brief, specific moment, Alara felt the quality of the situation balance on a knife edge. People like Marsh were dangerous most of all, when they were cornered but still functional, still able to shape the narrative. She'd seen it before. The reasonable voice, the injured tone, the careful reframing that made accusers look reckless and themselves look misunderstood. Marsh looked at Gideon. "I see you found an audience," he said. "He didn't find it," Ruth Corman said from her chair. Her voice was quiet and entirely without give. "We came." Marsh looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. He'd clearly not anticipated Ruth. She was the calculation he'd miscounted. "Ruth, don't," she said. "Just don't. I've been watching you for 18 months, and I've been quiet for 18 months, and I am done being quiet." The room had a quality of held breath, not fear, something more complicated. The specific tension of people who have been small for a long time and are feeling, for the first time, the possibility that they don't have to be. Marsh turned back to Gideon, and the easy manner was gone. What was underneath it was colder and more specific. "You have nothing that holds," he said. "Accounts from frightened people, a survey from a boy who was trespassing on private land, a freight ledger that shows nothing criminal. Whatever story you've been building in this room, there's a federal surveyor riding south right now with documentation that shows your boundary claims are fraudulent by 3 miles, Gideon said. It was the most words he'd said in sequence all morning, and he said them in the same stripped, flat tone as everything else. The water rights you've been claiming don't exist. The families you moved out to acquire those rights were defrauded, and the blasting equipment on the North Spur, which 3 people in this room can testify they've seen, was positioned to destroy evidence of the actual boundary markers. Marsh was quiet. The quality of his quiet was different from Gideon's quiet. Where Gideon's had always been settled, Marsh's was calculating, running options. "That's a significant allegation," he said finally, "based on the word of a man this town has known for years to be." "Don't finish that," Alara said. Marsh looked at her. "Whatever you are about to say about him," she said, "understand that every person in this room has already decided what weight to give it. And the answer is none." She held his gaze. "The stories you've been telling about Gideon Voss, I want you to know that I know that's what they are. Stories, useful ones. The kind of stories you tell when you need someone isolated and discredited and unavailable to contradict you." She paused. "They worked for a long time. They're not going to work anymore." A silence. Marsh looked around the room one more time, at each face, reading what was readable, and Alara watched him do the count. He was not a stupid man. Stupid men were in some ways easier to deal with because they kept coming when the math had turned against them. Smart men knew when to stop. He straightened his coat. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Gideon agreed. "It isn't." Marsh left. The room exhaled. Thomas put his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. Deckard Hendricks set the survey stake carefully on Arlo's desk. Ruth Corman looked at her hands in her lap for a moment, and then looked up at Gideon with an expression that had several things moving in it at once. "Winifred is going to hear about this," she said. "She's going to want to know." "Tell her," he said. Ruth nodded. She stood up and smoothed her coat and left without fanfare, which was, Alara thought, entirely consistent with who she was. Arlo looked at Gideon. "He's right that it's not finished. He's still got men on that ridge, and he's still got connections we don't know the full shape of." "I know." Gideon moved toward the door. "But the documents are moving south. The accounts are documented. And right now Marsh knows we know, which changes what he can do next." He stopped at the door and looked back at Alara. "Your brother needs a doctor." Thomas opened one eye. "I'm fine." "Your fingers are worse than you're pretending." Thomas opened the other eye. He looked at his hand and then at Gideon with the expression of someone who'd been hoping the conversation would go a different direction. "There's no doctor in Blackstone Ridge," he said. "No," Gideon said. "But there's a woman 3 streets over who was a surgeon's assistant for 15 years before she came out here. She'll do." He looked at Alara. "Take him. I'll be back." "Where are you going?" He was already through the door. "Back up the mountain," he said from outside. "I need to know what Marsh is doing." She stood in the doorway of the freight office and watched him cross the street. That same unhurried, substantial movement through a world that had always made room for him whether it wanted to or not. The sun was up fully now, cold and clear, throwing long shadows across the snow of the main street. Behind her, Thomas said, "He does that a lot, doesn't he? Just goes." "He does," she said. "And you let him." She looked at her brother. He was watching her with the particular expression of someone storing information for future deployment. "I'm letting him go do something necessary," she said. "That's not the same as letting him go." Thomas said nothing, but the expression didn't change. She turned back to the street. Gideon had already reached the far end and turned the corner toward the livery, heading for the mountain. She stood there a moment longer. The cold was definite and real around her, and the town was waking up, smoke from chimneys, the distant sound of the livery, a door opening somewhere down the street, the same town that had watched her ride in 3 days ago as a stranger, and watched Gideon with the flat avoidance of people who'd agreed among themselves not to see something. It looked the same. It wasn't. She turned back inside to take her brother to someone who could fix his hand, and whatever came next could wait the 20 minutes that would take. The woman 3 streets over was named Ida Marsh. No relation to Gerald, she said the first time anyone mentioned it, with the flat emphasis of someone who'd had to clarify this more than once and found it tiresome. She was 60 or so, compact and deliberate, with hands that moved over Thomas's frostbitten fingers, with the focused economy of someone who'd stopped needing to think about what they were doing and could simply do it. She worked in silence mostly, asking occasional precise questions. How long? What temperature? Had he kept it wrapped? Had he been stupid enough to try using it when it was at its worst? And Thomas answered each one with the honest brevity of a man who understood he was being assessed and that dishonesty would produce worse outcomes. Two of them are going to hurt for a while, she said, wrapping the last finger. The kind of hurt that reminds you every time the temperature drops. You'll keep them, but they're going to have opinions about cold weather for the rest of your life. I'll manage, Thomas said. You'll manage because you're young and stubborn. By the time you're 50, you'll have better respect for gloves. She looked at Alara. He needs to sleep. Actual sleep, not what he's been doing. I know. You look like you need it too. I know that as well. Ida looked at her for a moment with the particular assessment of a woman who'd spent her life being useful to people in difficult circumstances and had learned to read what they weren't saying. The Voss situation, she said. Not a question. Alara looked at her. You have opinions about Gideon Voss? I have observations. Ida put her supplies away with the same deliberate economy as everything else she did. I've been in this town 6 years. I've watched that man be treated like a problem that couldn't be solved and a danger that couldn't be quantified. And in 6 years, I have seen zero evidence of the first and nothing that justifies the second. I've also watched Gerald Marsh. She paused. The stories about Gideon started getting more specific right around the time Marsh started getting interested in the North Ridge territory. I noticed that. I didn't know what to do with it, but I noticed it. Why didn't you say something? Ida gave her a look that was not unkind but was entirely without illusion. To who? The settlement council that Marsh runs? The people who'd been told for years that Gideon Voss was dangerous and had arranged their understanding of every piece of information to fit that. She closed her bag. Observations without structure aren't testimony. They're just the private concerns of a woman who patches people up and mostly gets thanked for it and then ignored. Alara felt the accuracy of that land somewhere. The shape of it. How information sat useless and unmoving until it had a structure to move through. Thomas had built that structure with 11 days of survey work. Cal Briggs was currently moving it south. But the years before that, all the accumulated observations of people like Ida who'd noticed and filed and done nothing because there was nothing to do, that was its own kind of damage. Quiet and invisible and entirely real. For what it's worth, Alara said, you can say it now. Ida looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, brief and decided. I'll talk to Ruth Corman, she said. Gideon came back from the mountain 4 hours later. He came in through the front of the hotel where Alara had been sitting with cold coffee and Thomas asleep upstairs, and he was moving carefully in a way he hadn't been moving when he left, and there was blood on the left side of his coat that hadn't been there before. She was on her feet before she'd made a conscious decision. It's not serious, he said before she could speak. Sit down. Sit down, Gideon. He sat. She looked at the coat and he let her look, which told her something about how much the morning had cost him. He was not a man who let people assess him easily, and the fact that he didn't argue meant some part of him had already weighed his options and concluded that arguing would take more energy than complying. The cut was on his left side, high on the rib cage, a knife cut, clean-edged, not deep but long, the kind that came from a blade meant to do more that had been redirected by movement or luck or both. She'd seen enough of those to know that not deep was a relative term and that long had its own complications. Marsh's men, she said, 2 of them, on the trail coming down. He was watching her face while she worked, not with pain in his expression, but with the fixed attention of someone managing pain by directing his awareness somewhere else. They'd been waiting. He sent them ahead when he left town. I walked into it. You walked into a 2-man ambush. I walked into one, he said. I was aware of the second. That's not the reassuring distinction you think it is. She pressed cloth against the cut and held it. He didn't flinch, which was its own kind of information. What happened to them? They're on the trail. They'll make it back to town. He paused. Eventually. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the directness that she'd come to understand was not aggression, but simply how he operated. No mediation, no performance, just the thing itself. The equipment on the spur, he said. It's gone. They moved it when I cut the fuse line last night. I tracked where they took it. There's a second position further east, better concealed. They weren't planning to give up on the rock slide. They were planning to do it from somewhere I didn't know about. We're planning. I found it. dismantled what I could reach, buried the rest under a slide I started further up the spur. He said it without satisfaction. It won't survive the spring thaw intact. They'd need to bring entirely new equipment up to try again. And by then, Cal Briggs will have reached Aldred at the federal office. Yes. She tied off the bandage with 2 clean knots and sat back and looked at him. The exhausted, cut, slightly battered man who had gone up the mountain alone that morning, not because it was heroic, but because it was necessary, and he was the one who knew how to do it. She thought about what Ida had said. Observations without structure. She thought about all the years this man had existed in a town that looked through him, or looked at him and saw the story Marsh had built, and had never once wondered whether the story had an architect. All those years of Gideon simply continuing, going up the mountain, knowing the trails, bringing down bodies in storms, building fires that kept people alive, and none of it being visible to people whose vision had been prearranged for them. The thing about fear is that it's efficient. It packages people. It files them in places that are easy to reach and never need to be re-examined. Fear of Gideon Voss had been useful to Gerald Marsh in a very specific and practical way, and Marsh had maintained it with the care of a man tending something valuable. She understood something in that moment, sitting in the hotel with the cold coffee going colder and Gideon across from her with her bandaging on his ribs. She understood that the cruelest thing about what had been done to him wasn't the isolation, though the isolation was real and had cost him years. It was the theft of ordinary things, the ability to walk down a street without a room rearranging itself, the ability to have an exchange at a counter without the person behind the counter deciding what kind of exchange it was going to be before it started. All the small, unremarkable moments of being a person among other people that had been made unavailable to him by a story someone else wrote. He was watching her think. She'd noticed that he did this, let her process without filling the space. "What?" he said. "I was thinking about what it cost you, the years of it." He was quiet for a moment. Don't what?" "Don't spend your energy on that. It's done." "That doesn't mean it didn't." "I know what it means." His voice was even. Not dismissive, something more careful than that. "I know what those years were. I've had time to know. But the ledger on that is closed, and what I've got now is what's in front of me." He looked at her steadily. "That's enough." She held his gaze. The afternoon light was coming through the window at an angle that fell across the floor between them, and the hotel was quiet except for the distant sounds of the town going about its day outside. "All right," she said. 3 days later, Gerald Marsh left Blackstone Ridge. He didn't leave the way people leave when they've made a choice, with a loaded wagon and time for goodbyes. He left with 2 men in the early morning, moving south on the main trail, and the only reason anyone knew he'd gone was that Arlo Petch opened the freight office at dawn to find a brief note on his counter that said, in Marsh's careful handwriting, that he was stepping down from the settlement council for personal reasons and wished the town well. Arlo read it twice and then put it in his freight ledger as documentation, which seemed to Alara like the right response. The men Marsh had left on the ridge came down the following day. Not his 2 from the trail. Those 2 had returned to town with injuries they declined to explain and left inside of 12 hours. The remaining ridge crew came down in a group, looked at the town, and kept riding south. Whatever Marsh had been paying them, the payment had apparently concluded. The survey stake Deckard Hendricks had kept sat on Arlo's desk until a federal officer arrived from the land office 9 days after Cal Briggs had ridden south. The officer's name was Reeve, a thin, deliberate man in his 40s who asked precise questions and wrote everything down and had the quietly skeptical manner of a government official who'd seen enough fraudulent claims to start from doubt and work toward belief rather than the reverse. He spent 3 days in Blackstone Ridge, interviewing Arlo and Ruth and the Hendricks brothers and Ida and Thomas, whose fingers had improved enough that he could demonstrate the survey methodology with his own maps. On the 3rd day, Reeve asked to speak with Gideon. They sat in Arlo's back office, the same crowded, ledger-stacked space that had held the morning gathering a week and a half before, and Reeve asked Gideon what he'd observed on the North Ridge over the past 2 years, and Gideon told him. Not with drama, not with argument, just with the flat, specific, date-ordered account of a man who'd been watching something develop, and had simply kept the information because there was nowhere to take it, and letting it go seemed like the wrong choice. Reeve listened and wrote, and at the end he looked at Gideon over his notes, with an expression that was not quite apology, but was something adjacent to it. "You've been up on that ridge regularly for 2 years," he said. "Yes." "And you've seen the boundary markers being moved." "I've seen markers placed that don't match the original survey lines. I know what the original lines look like. I've had reason to know those mountains thoroughly." "Why didn't you report it?" Gideon looked at him. "To who?" he said. It was the same thing Ida had said. Allura, standing in the doorway, heard it and felt it land the same way both times. That flat, practical question that contained an entire history of institutional invisibility. Reeve heard it too. She saw it in the slight pause before he wrote something down and moved to his next question. The Caldwell Land Syndicate's claims were formally invalidated 4 weeks after Reeve's visit, when the Federal Land Office issued findings based on Thomas's survey documentation and the additional field verification that Reeve's office conducted. The water rights reverted. The fraudulent boundary stakes were removed and replaced with correct markers. The families who'd left didn't all come back. That's the part that doesn't resolve neatly, and it shouldn't, because it's the part that's most true. The Taft family had built a new life in a different territory and decided that what they'd built was worth more than returning to what they'd lost. One of the smaller homesteaders had sold off and spent the money. Winifred Keller and her husband came back in early spring, and Ruth Corman stood in the main street and watched her sister's wagon come up the south road and didn't say anything, just stood there with her arms crossed and her jaw tight in the way of a person trying to manage something too large for a single expression. Thomas stayed in Blackstone Ridge through the winter and into spring, doing survey work for the homesteaders who wanted their boundaries properly documented now that there was reason to believe the documentation would hold. His fingers healed mostly, with 2 of them retaining exactly the cold weather sensitivity Ida had predicted, which he regarded as a reasonable price. He wrote detailed reports for the Federal Land Office and spoke at the formal hearing that followed in the spring, and he was good at it, clear, precise, credible in the way that young people are credible when they've done the work and know it. He also developed the habit, which he'd never had before, of not talking as much when he was nervous. He claimed he hadn't noticed this change in himself. No one who spent time with him believed that. The Settlement Council was restructured without Marsh, with Arlo Petch as temporary chair, a role he accepted with visible reluctance and quiet competence. Ruth Corman joined the council in the spring, which surprised nobody who'd watched her in Arlo's back office on that early morning. Gideon didn't join the council. Nobody asked him to, and he wouldn't have said yes if they had. But something changed in the way the town moved around him. Not dramatically, not the sudden warm embrace of a community that had spent years treating a man as a ghost and now wanted credit for seeing him. It was smaller than that and more durable. The way Deckard Hendricks nodded when they passed in the street. The way the woman who'd pulled her child closer on that first day now let the child run ahead to the livery in the mornings without redirecting. The freight clerk at the window who'd once answered in 4 words because 5 would have suggested familiarity, now asked, briefly and without ceremony, how the North Trails were running. It was ordinary. It was the specific, unremarkable weight of ordinary human acknowledgement extended to someone who'd been denied it for years, and because it was ordinary, it was more valuable than anything dramatic would have been. Allura stayed. She'd planned to stay through the winter until Thomas was found and the syndicate situation resolved itself one way or another, and the practical reasons for being in Blackstone Ridge had concluded. The practical reasons concluded. She stayed. Not because of Gideon, she would have said if anyone had asked, or not entirely, or not in the way the question implied. She stayed because the Upper Valley needed a proper survey done, and Thomas was one person with 2 partially frostbitten fingers. She stayed because Arlo's freight operation needed someone with organizational sense, and she had it. She stayed because Blackstone Ridge was a place in the process of becoming something, and she'd spent enough of her life moving through places that had already finished becoming things that the unfinished quality of this one felt like something she could affect rather than just observe. Those were the true reasons, and also not the only ones. In the spring, on a day when the snow on the high peaks had begun its long retreat and the Upper Valley was running with melt and the trails were passable again, She rode up the secondary route alone for the first time. She knew it well enough by then, had learned every unmarked turn, every stone placed at an angle, the hidden depression in the tree line that anyone else would have walked past. She came out above the timberline and sat her horse and looked at the valley below, white and flat still at the floor, but with the dark line of the unfrozen creek showing now through the middle of it. She heard his horse before she heard him. He came out of the trees to the east and pulled up beside her without speaking, and they sat there together in the cold, clear air for a moment. "You knew I was up here," she said. "I saw you leave the livery." "You didn't have to follow." "I know." Below them, the valley was doing what valleys do in spring, becoming itself again after a season of being something else. The creek ran. A hawk turned wide circles above the flat white floor. Somewhere in the trees below, something moved through the underbrush with the unhurried confidence of an animal that had no particular reason to be afraid. "I want to tell you something," Elara said. He looked at her. "I came here to find Thomas," she said. "That's the true version. I didn't come here for any of the rest of it. I didn't come here for you." She paused. "But the rest of it happened anyway, and I've been trying to decide whether that changes what I owe it. Whether something that arrives without being chosen deserves the same consideration as something you went looking for." He was quiet. The hawk below made another pass. "And?" he said. "I think it might deserve more," she said. "The things you choose, you can talk yourself into. You have reasons ready. The things that arrive on their own, those you can't argue about. They're just true or they're not." He looked at her for a long moment. The mountain was entirely itself around them, indifferent, enormous, demanding nothing and offering nothing except the specific reality of its presence, which was everything. "I'm not easy," he said. It wasn't self-deprecation. It was information, offered plainly. "I'm aware of that. I've been alone long enough that I've developed habits around it. The kind that don't necessarily—" "Gideon," he stopped. "I spent the first 28 years of my life being told that the way I am is too much," she said. "Too direct, too big, too certain of my own judgment. I've heard every version of 'you're not what people expected,' and I've decided not to make that my problem anymore." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking you to be easy. I'm not interested in easy. I'm interested in true." The wind moved across the slope above them, lifted the snow surface in a brief curl of white, and settled again. He looked at the valley. She looked at the valley. Below, the creek ran south, carrying the winter away. "I've got a cabin on the north slope," he said finally. "It needs work. The east wall took damage in the storms this season, and the roof over the back room has a problem I've been meaning to address since last fall." She understood what he was saying. It wasn't romantic language, and it wasn't meant to be. It was the language of a practical man extending an invitation in the only way he knew how, by describing what was real and leaving room in the description for someone else to step into. "I'm fairly good with a roof," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been watching you work for 2 months." She almost laughed. The almost laugh turned into an actual one, brief and genuine, the kind that arrives before you decide whether it's appropriate. He looked at her when she laughed. That look, the one she'd first seen across a fire in a rock shelter in a storm, the one that lasted longer than his others and meant something she'd spent weeks learning to read. It meant that he was deciding something, that he was taking something seriously in the way he took the mountains seriously, with the full, undivided attention of a man who understood that the things worth attending to required the real version of you and not a managed approximation. "Spring's a good time to fix a roof," he said. "It is," she agreed. They rode back down together on the trail she'd learned from him, through the trees and the meltwater and the particular smell of a high country coming back to itself after winter. Below them, Blackstone Ridge went about its day. Thomas was somewhere down there working his survey lines. Ruth Corman was at the dry goods counter, and Arlo was at his freight window, and Ida was tending to whoever needed tending, and the town was doing the unspectacular essential work of becoming a place people could trust. There are stories people tell about the frontier, and most of them are about the dramatic things, the moments of obvious courage, the clear confrontations between right and wrong with a visible resolution at the end. Those stories are not useless, but they're incomplete. What they leave out is the longer work, the choosing to stay, the slow rebuilding of what fear and deliberate cruelty had damaged, the morning after morning accumulation of ordinary trust that doesn't look like much from the outside and is the only thing that actually holds. Gideon Voss had spent years being the story people told each other to explain what they were afraid of. He'd carried that for so long it had become its own kind of weight. Not the story itself, which he'd never believed, but the reality of being seen only through it, the weight of being readable only as someone else's fiction. What changes a story is not a single act of courage, though courage matters. It's not a dramatic revelation, though the truth eventually getting out matters too. What changes a story is someone deciding to read it differently, and then someone else, and then a few more, until the original version requires too much maintenance to survive. Alara Quinn hadn't come to Blackstone Ridge to change a story. She'd come to find her brother. But she'd looked at a man an entire town had chosen not to see, and she'd looked at him plainly and without the convenient architecture of someone else's fear, and she'd seen what was there. That's not heroism, it's just attention. The specific, demanding, ordinary kind. The kind that requires you to stay present when presence is uncomfortable, to revise when revision is inconvenient, to keep looking when looking costs you the easier version of things. She'd done it because Thomas needed a guide, and Gideon was the one who knew the mountain. That was the whole of it, at the start. The rest arrived on its own. By the time they reached the valley floor and turned east toward town, the sun had moved west enough to turn the snow on the high peaks from white to the particular amber that meant late afternoon was settling toward evening. Gideon's shadow stretched long across the trail beside hers, two shadows moving together in the cold, golden light, imprecise and overlapping at the edges the way shadows are when the light hits from the side. The town was ahead. There was work to do. They went toward it together.